Okay, today we're doing part 2 of our series about these 10 animals that the Torah lists. And today we're going to do the animals from the first pasuk, which are Shor, Seh Kesavim, and Seh Izim. Okay, so let's do them one at a time. Let's start with Shor. Okay, everybody knows that a Shor is a cow. Now, technically, cow is not really the right word because cow is female, and we probably should say steer or bull or ox. But anyhow, everybody calls it cow, so we'll call them a cow. But this fact that everybody knows that a shor means a cow, that in itself, I know it's very simple, that brings out our issue we're going to have with identifying the 10 species. You remember last time we spoke about how it's not just 10 kosher animals, it's really 10 species, and we have to figure out which animals fit in with each of the species. So if you pause and you say, okay, we know that a shor is a cow. What is it about cows that makes you realize that this cow is not a different animal? When you look at a cow, you say, I know it's not a horse or a sheep or a cat. How do you know? What is it about it that makes you look at it and say, I know this is a cow? Is it because how big it is? It's domesticated, its horns, its hooves, its tail, its diet. What is it about it that you look at and you say, oh, I could tell that thing is a cow? And what other things that maybe that you can't see, like its digestive system or reproductive system or respiratory system? What else is there about that you look at that somehow makes it stick out as a cow? If we knew the answers to all these questions, that might help us figure out whether does Shor include buffalo, bison, aurochs, zebu, which are all they're similar to cows, but they're not exactly cows. So that's part of our question, our big question that we're trying to, this whole project is trying to figure out is, what is it about special animals? So we're going to come back to figuring out what a shor is in part 4 of this series. But for now, we sort of have a question. It sort of brings out the point. The obviousness of what a cow is brings out the point of, well, what is it about each animal that makes us wonder what it is? Okay, now, just one more thing about cows, about shor, is the Gemara says, that horns, you could use horns of any animal for a shofar except for a cow's horn, because the Torah calls it a karen, and never calls it a shofar. It just calls it a karen. It doesn't call it a shofar, and therefore that the horn of a cow can't be used for a shofar. In Mirz Hashem, again, part 4, we're going to get back to talking about that. A little bit more details about that thing. Okay, so that was pretty easy. That was a shor. We know what a cow is. We're not really sure whether some of these other things that might fit into cow fit into it also. Again, we'll get back to that, and we'll move on to the next one. That one was, I guess, relatively simple. Okay, the next is Seh Kesavim. So Seh Kesavim means a sheep, and Seh Izim, which is we're going to do next, means a goat. So obviously from the pasuk, it's pretty obvious in the pasuk that the word Seh can mean both goat and sheep, to the point that the Torah has to differentiate and say Seh Kesavim and Seh Izim, because each one by itself is not so clear what it is. The word Seh could go both of them. And also, for example, when the Torah talks about the mitzvah of the Isra Oisav Esbenoi, it says Shor Oiseh, and the word Seh there means sheep and goats. Okay, Seh means both. And therefore, it has to say Seh Kesavim to tell you it means sheep, and Seh Izim to tell you it means goats. Okay, well, that brings up two questions. First is, so why did it say Seh altogether? Why didn't it just say Kesavim and Izim? Why did it have to say the word Seh altogether? And second is it interesting, of all the 10 animals that are listed, only these 2 animals, Kesavim and Izim, are listed in plural. Say Kesavim and Izim, as opposed to, it didn't say Shorim or Shvarim, I don't know how you'd say that, or other animals, it didn't say, I don't know what, Tzviim or Tzivim, it didn't say it, just said all in single. So why did it say these in double? The Gemara actually talks about this. We want to have some machlokes about what we should take from the fact that it said Seh for both of the words. So Yeshua says, well, why does it say Seh both times, and why does it say in plural the names of the animals are the Kesavim and Izim? So Rabbi Yeshua says that it's because the animal is only kosher if both of its parents were a Seh. Say Kesavim, it has to come from 2 sheep. Both parents have to be sheep. But if a female sheep, what we call a female sheep became pregnant from another animal, like I'm guessing like a non-kosher animal, then and the animal that was born does not have simoni kashrus, it would not be considered kosher. Okay, that's what Rabbi Shua says. The mother, the one who gave birth to this animal, was a kosher animal. But since it doesn't have simon kashrus and it came from a non-kosher, the father was non-kosher, then it would be not kosher because it has to be from Kesavim. It has to come from two kosher sheep. Rabbi Eliezer argues. He says no, the opposite. The reason why it says Seh twice in the pasuk, it says Seh Kesavim, Seh Izim, to tell you that it doesn't make a difference what the animal looks like. It doesn't make a difference who the father was. If it came from a kosher animal, then it's a seh. No matter where it came from, it's considered a seh, which is to say and that's the basis of the rule many are familiar with, which is yotzim tar. If it came from a kosher animal, the mother was kosher, it is considered kosher, even though it may have simon kashrus, even though its father might not be having kosher, and that's in fact the din in Simon Ayin Tes. That's the din that learned from the fact that the Torah says said twice, and it says in plural the parents Kesavim and Izim like that. Okay, now the fact that these two animals, sheep and goats, both could be called Seh, tells us that there's something very similar about them. Okay, which is to say is that they look similar and they're about the same size. And in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about halachic application on the fact that they look similar. Okay, but they're similar. That people confuse them with each other. Young ones, particularly. Okay, now one of the noticeable differences between sheep and goats is once they start having horns. Now, I'll mention some other things that are not as relevant. Some of the other things is that we're going to talk soon about whether they have wool or hair. We'll talk about that in a minute. Second is, in goats, their tails face upwards, and in sheep, their tails face downwards. And another thing is that sheep are grazers, which means is they eat things that are low down, grass and other things that are low, as opposed to goats are browsers, which means they eat leaves and fruits and shrubs that are a little higher up. Okay, so those are some other differences between them. But what we're going to focus on right now is that once they have horns, their horns are not like one another. And once they start growing horns, because goats have horns that are sort of straight back from the animal's head, they basically go straight back with a little bit of a bend. And a sheep horn, especially the male sheep, the rams, curl around and almost like into a full circle. Okay, and that feature that male sheep have these round horns is brought out in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says you should use a horn of a ram, of an ayil, for blowing on the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, because it's kafuf, okay, because it's bent. Okay, we will get back to that in Mirz Hashem next time, not this time, in part 3 of the series. But it's because the shofars, because their horns are bent, encourages us to be bent over in contrition. It's a day of tshuva, so we bent over to be more humble and more ready to do tshuva. Okay, Mirz Hashem, we're going to talk more about what kafuf means and how it fits in Mirz Hashem next time when we get to whatever other animals. Okay, so female sheep are less likely to have horns than rams, and when they do have, they tend to be shorter and not as curled as rams' horns. And that fact that the female sheep have horns that are not as dramatic as the male sheep, not as unusual or dramatic as the male one, is going to help us explain pshat in a Mishnah, actually. And that goes like this. There's a Mishnah in Masechtas Chaim, the beginning of Masechtas Chaim, tells us all kinds of animals that are Chaim with one another, even though they seem similar. And the Mishnah is going to tell you these two animals that seem alike, even though they seem alike, they're considered Chaim because they're not enough to be considered the same man. Okay? And every animal in that Mishnah is written b'lashon zachar except for one, and that's a Rachel. Okay? And it says there, a Rachel is similar to a Yael, and but even so, it's Chaim b'zeh b'zeh. And the Mirz Hashem next time when we get to talking about a Yael, we'll talk about what that means. Why the Mishnah says that. But why did the Mishnah, of all the animals that it lists, did it tell us that a Rachel, when it comes to sheep, it uses the female? All the other ones it lists the male. And it could be that it's because if you look at a male sheep, an adult male sheep, and with this big curled up horn, it's obvious to you that that animal is not the same as Yael or any other animal. It's so distinct. It's obviously it's colliding with these other kinds of animals. So when you see the female sheep, you say, that's not so different. That its horns are not as unusual and special, and therefore. You might think it's not climbing with Yael, so the Mishnah tells you that even so it is. So using the female helps bring out the point. It helps is what might lead you to think that they're one min. To then when it's not a min, that to tell you that it's climb. Okay. Now there's two things about sheep that seem to be the ones that make it distinct. What we think are the features that would make it into a min. One is this ram's horn that I keep talking about. And there's one that's even more unique, and that is that sheep have wool. Okay, that means is most mammals are covered with hair or fur, which is similar, which grows long and pretty straight, and that's hair. But sheep grow something different. They grow wool, not hair. They grow wool, which is soft, thick fibers, and they grow in these crimpy strands, like curled up, crimpy strands. Also. Another difference between wool and hair is that wool grows forever, just keeps on going longer and longer and longer unless you cut it off. As opposed to hair, every piece of hair only lasts for so long. At a certain point, it falls out, which is why it doesn't get too long. It only gets to so long, not because it can't get long, but because it falls out. Let's say after a month or 2 months or 6 months, whatever the hair grows for, then it falls out. And by that time, it couldn't have gotten so long. Okay, so sheep are unusual in that they have wool and other animals don't. Now, there are animals, even some goats, that have some wool, and there are even some sheep that grow hair, it's true. But what's unusual about sheep is that they grow lots of wool. Okay, now, for example, in goats, they grow hair that you could turn into fabric if you want to, which is a wool-like fabric. It's not wool, it's wool like wool. Those, which is like, for example, cashmere, Angora, and mohair, those are all made from goat's hair, and they seem similar to wool, but they're not wool. Okay, these are the tavu Seh Izim when they made for the Mishkan. The Urials Seh Izim they made from goat's hair, but that's not wool. Okay, so that's not wool, and we even call them barcha karcha. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin that goats are called barcha karcha because they're the bald sheep. Karcha means bald, and karcha means bald, and barcha means sheep. Rashi says that because they don't have any wool, they have hair. They're not bald in that way, but they're bald in that they have no wool. Okay, because they have hair, and they have hair that can be made into fabric that's like materials that are like wool, but they're not. It's not wool. Okay, so now we know these two features of sheep. They have these. The rams have these curled horns, and they have wool. So now let's think about other animals. So there's an animal called a Racka, which is a domesticated kosher animal. Originally, it came from Hungary, and it has these long, like corkscrewing horns, not round like a ram. They sort of twist around within themselves. I don't know how else to describe it. I have a picture, but I can't do that. In a recording that's not video. And they have these dreadlocks of wool. So seemingly, if wool is our feature we're looking for, then these animals would be considered Seh Kesavim. They're considered within the sheep min. Okay, the horns are not circular like a ram. But if the main thing we're looking for is wool, then they would be. So seemingly that would put them in part of the group called Seh Kesavim, which is sheep. What's not so clear is what do we do the opposite way? There's two other animals. Racka is kosher. The question is just what min to put into. Two other kosher animals are Mouflons and Urials. I hope I'm pronouncing all these right, which are non-domesticated animal, and they have horns that look very similar to a male sheep. They really, if you saw them, you say, oh, that looks very much like a sheep's horn, like a ram's horn, but they don't grow much wool at all. So what should we do with them? Should we say that they're Seh Kesavim without wool? Sheep and wool goes together. And you see a sheep, one of its features is that it has this wool. And these animals don't grow wool, they grow hair. Now, another thing is, we'll see in our very last part 5 of this series, there's another question, which is that they're non-domesticated. Does that automatically mean if they're non-domesticated that they can't be part of Seh Kesavim, which is a domesticated animal? We'll get to that in part 5. Actually, the Gemara has 4 opinions of what the status is of a kfi, and one of them is that maybe it's an ayal habar it's a non-domesticated ram, and is therefore a chaya. And that might be actually what this animal is. Maybe that kvi is a Mouflon or an Urials, those kind of animals. Anyhow, the Shulchan Aruch rules that kfi is a suffix if it's a behem or a chaya, so we're machmir to treat it as both. Again, we'll talk that in part 5. So again, we have these two features about a Seh Kesavim, the wool and the curled circular horns. Not clear which one is the ikar, and we have these different animals that potentially do or don't fit into Seh Kesavim based on which one is ikar, if both of them are ikar or not sure. Okay, and of course, Seh Kesavim, as I mentioned, are behemoths; they're not chayas. Okay, and the last for today is Seh Izim, goats, and it's a behemoth; it's not a chaya. And we'll see next time. There are some other animals that are non-domesticated that are similar to Izim, which are considered to be chayas. Okay, we'll get to them. Just for the wording of it, the Torah calls it an Izim, Seh Izim, which is a goat. The Torah also calls them a tayish, like in Bereshis. They call it a tayish. That's a male goat. The Gemara uses the word taisha for a female goat. That's not a word from Tanakh. It's a Lashon Nekeva version of the word tayish. Anyhow, and they are So a goat is a chai. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about Seh Kesavim, I mentioned that both Seh Kesavim and Seh Izim are both referred to as a seh. Both goats and sheep are called a seh. And the Mishnah Berurah says that because of that, if a person doesn't have a ram's horn to blow as a shofar of Rosh Hashanah, they should choose a goat's horn. And that's because there's two reasons why a person should use, the best choice is to use a ram's horn for Rosh Hashanah. There are two reasons for that. One is because it's kafuf, because it's curled over, it's rounded. And again, we'll talk about next time exactly what that means, but it's somehow because it's rounded, that's the best choice. And that reminds us about, that's the one reason to which we kafuf on day of Rosh Hashanah. But there's a second reason. The second reason is that by Akedis Yitzchak, it ended up when Avram Avinu shechted ram instead of Yitzchak. In the end, Hashem pulled back and said, "Don't shecht him," and said instead he shechted a ram. The Mishnah Berurah says if you don't have a ram's horn, then you're not going to get another horn that's kafuf, but at least you should get a goat's horn, because a goat's horn is a goat is also a seh. So a sheep and a goat are both considered a seh. So your second choice is to get seh, because at least the second connection is there. Which is to say, Avram Avinu took a ram to shech instead of Yitzchak, but he basically took a seh. So this is an alternate type of seh, which we have a different name for it. We call it izim, or we call it in English we call it goats, but it's close enough. Seh and seh, it's still a zecher for Akedis Yitzchak. So Lamaisa, the Mishnah Berurah says, if your person doesn't have a ram's horn to blow shofar with, the next best choice is to use a goat's horn, because at least it has one of the connections, one of the reasons why it has one of the advantages of a ram's horn. One of the things that the Mishnah says that Izim are klayim with a tzvi. Again, I told you the Mishnah gives this list of different animals that seem similar, but they're not, and they're klayim one with another. And the Mishnah says that Izim and the tzvi are klayim one another. And the Mishnah next time, when we get to tzvi, we'll talk about what did the Mishnah have in mind? What did it think was similar about them that now we should start saying, and that we have to tell you that they are klayim with one another. Okay, that's the end of part 2. In part 3, and in part 4, we will talk about the other 7 animals which are the chayas, the other 7 animals listed in the pasuk.